It's kind of crazy to think how much video games have evolved since their early days. I mean, just look at the screen. This is what a lot of first-person RPGs used to look like. A bunch of straight lines to create the illusion of depth, and fairly low resolution sprites that only had 16 colors to work with. Back then, upgrading to 256 colors was already a massive leap that made some games look absolutely stunning. And yet, it pales in comparison to things that would be achieved just years later, eventually getting us to a point where the first-person RPG can look like this.
And it's just like...
Now, you won't catch me saying that higher fidelity graphics are always superior in any sense but technical. Games that are built with limitations in mind still look beautiful, but those limitations still exist, both artistic and technical. And that's where remakes come into play. While they're more common these days, some examples go as far back as 80s and 90s. As both software and hardware gets better, developers occasionally decide that, hey, how about we take the game we made and remake it with better graphics, better sounds, well, better everything, really. We could even add some mechanics that we couldn't before, or tweak things that didn't end up working out too well in the original release. And by all means, it seems like a pretty good idea because some of the best games in recent years have been remakes. But for some reason, this practice has never caught on with fighting games.
Why isn't it possible?
It's just not.
Why not, you stupid bastard?
It feels like the prerequisites are all here. 90s were by far the most prolific decade when it came to fighting game releases, so it's limitations galore. Even games from the past decade or so are old enough that they could use a facelift. Perhaps the most obvious upgrade would be the addition of rollback netcode and other online features, since it's by far the main way of playing fighting games these days. We already get some updated versions, like what Code Mystics have been doing, and Fightgate takes care of a good chunk of older titles as well. But it only goes so far. The visuals should be pretty straightforward as well, but let's address the elephant in the room. Lots of people love the 2D sprite work of older games, but 2D fighters are for the most part not a thing anymore. We want to dive more into that pretty soon, but for now the major issues are that it's expensive, it's hard to make, they don't scale as well as 3D models, and you basically have to say goodbye to monetization based on cosmetics. No, if we're going to get a remake of a 2D game, it's more than likely gonna get an additional dimension. 3D games are a no-brainer by comparison, since you can just take what's already there and redo it with modern technology. A far bigger problem here is, how do you handle the gameplay? There are usually two ways to approach a remake. Purists want to get the original game with as few changes as possible. Just keep every important part of the game the exact same and upgrade the rest. Good examples of that are something like Crash Insane Trilogy or the Super Mario RPG. Other players are usually more lenient and don't mind changes as long as the game is still fun and there is clear respect to the tone and advance of the original titles. Resident Evil 2 Remake is the best example of this. It plays nothing like the original, but it still feels like the same game, just, well, remade. If I had to guess, a lot of fighting game players probably fall into the purist camp. I mean, we have people arguing against patching games too often, even when it's small adjustments. Imagine how mad they would be if a familiar game suddenly received a whole new mechanic or something along those lines. However, there is room for purist remakes if you take more refined editions of older titles, like Soul Calibur 2, Tekken 5 DR, KOF 98, MK9, or Bloody Roar Extreme. Those games have largely stood the test of time, so you could probably get away with only touching the graphics and adding new features. That said, we all know how busted some of the oldest games are. Even the much revered Third Strike is fun, but not perfect. The recent Evo was a good example of that, with Chun-Li and Yun running the streets. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Plenty of other characters also have some tricks up their sleeves that probably wouldn't fly in modern fighting games. Then there's basically any older Tekken game where we have everything from outright broken moves to infinite combos. They could use a re-release that just makes them playable on modern systems, but they could also benefit from a serious rebalancing and maybe even bigger changes, taking the original ideas and refining them to create a game that might just be better than the original. Unfortunately, even after all that, there is one more problem that likely stops most remakes from ever existing: return on investment. Fighting games is not quite the genre that you get into to sell a lot of copies and make a lot of money. I'm sure we can name some exceptions, but that's all they are, exceptions. Even the biggest franchises had a few flops. Needless to say, it is so much harder to get anywhere for smaller developers and titles that don't have massive publishers backing them up. Considering the risk, difficulty, and financial burden that comes with making a video game, you can't afford to make something that doesn't sell, unless you are already one of the biggest fighting game publishers out there. Companies like Capcom or Bandai Namco already have the funds and experience to develop a game, promote it, and then support it. All of those are vital for success, so if we do see some remakes, it would have to come from them. In fact, Sega has a chance to be the first, because Virtua Fighter is long overdue for a comeback, though if I had to guess, they would probably go for a reboot over a remake. Either way, how do you feel about this? Are there any remakes that you'd like to see? Tell us in the comments and make sure to subscribe for more videos about fighting games. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and bye bye.